The world is engulfed in the flames of World War II. Axis and Allied forces clash in a brutal struggle, shaping the course of history and leaving millions dead. Amidst this turmoil, Pope Pius XII remains confined to the Vatican, the spiritual guide for Catholics worldwide. His role is pivotal as he navigates the Church through humanity's darkest hour. While the world reeled from the horrors unfolding across Europe, the Pope remained silent. Despite being privy to the atrocities perpetrated by Hitler's regime, including the systematic extermination of millions of Jews in concentration camps, Pius XII chose not to speak out against these abominable acts. The silence of the Vatican in the face of Nazi atrocities raises profound questions about the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Third Reich. Despite ideological differences, reports reveal instances of collaboration and even a pact between the Church and Hitler's regime. Shockingly, some within the clergy expressed admiration for Hitler, blurring the lines between the cross of Christ and the swastika. The Catholic Church in the 1930s, while a global institution, was heavily Eurocentric in its hierarchy. Its power was also far from absolute. The era of papal armies and direct control of vast territories was centuries past. The Church's weapons were now moral authority, diplomatic influence, and the loyalty of the faithful, formidable but also more nebulous in a time of radical politics.
Let's unveil the secrets of time.
Behind the walls of the Vatican, a Pope's wartime dilemma. The Nazi invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, shattered Europe's fragile peace and ignited the deadliest conflict in human history. Only 2 days after the invasion, Achille Ratti, who had succeeded Pius XI earlier that year, ascended the papal throne as Pius XII. He inherited a world swiftly descending into chaos. In his initial encyclical entitled Summi Pontificatus, on the unity of human society, released less than a month after the outbreak of war, Pius XII condemned the conflict. He laid bare the horrors witnessed in Poland, the aggression and violence inflicted on a sovereign nation, and spoke of the anguish and fearful expectations gripping Europe. However, the encyclical stopped short of explicitly naming Nazi Germany as the aggressor, a pattern that would define much of his wartime papacy. The fundamental tenet of Pius XII's wartime policy was a strict adherence to Vatican neutrality. While popes had historically played significant diplomatic roles, the devastation of World War I had reinforced a view that neutrality was essential to preserving the Church's moral authority. Pius XII and his advisors believed that aligning with any side, Allied or Axis, would cripple the Vatican's ability to act as a mediator or provide humanitarian aid. Neutrality was also seen as a way to protect the institution of the Church. The Vatican City, a sovereign state within the City of Rome, was physically vulnerable. If the Pope was perceived as an enemy by any belligerent power, the fragile independence of the Holy See could be threatened. Moreover, the Catholic Church was a global entity, with faithful living in every nation involved in the conflict. Choosing sides would mean alienating Catholics, fighting against each other across battle lines. This policy of neutrality would be relentlessly pursued by Pius XII. It would drive his wartime actions and become the main point of contention in the decades-long controversy about his legacy. Critics would charge that neutrality in the face of unprecedented evil was moral cowardice, while defenders would argue that it was the only realistic course to preserve the Church and enable any form of assistance to those in need. Despite the outward stance of neutrality, Pius XII and the Vatican were not passive bystanders. The Pope's first move was to call for peace and a negotiated settlement to the Polish crisis, but it was an appeal that fell on deaf ears. The momentum of Hitler's war machine was unstoppable. During the early months of the war, Pius XII exchanged messages with leaders of the warring nations, including Hitler, urging restraint and offering the Vatican as a facilitator of dialogue. Simultaneously, covert channels were activated. High-ranking German military officers, disillusioned with Hitler and fearful of another catastrophic war, reached out to the Vatican, hoping to broker a peace with Britain. Pius XII was kept informed of these back channels. aware that any involvement was dangerous if discovered by the Nazis. While the intentions behind these overtures were debatable, they reflected a sliver of hope for a peaceful resolution that quickly evaporated. Both Hitler and the Western Allies became convinced that only total victory was achievable. While efforts to halt the war itself quickly faltered, the Vatican shifted its focus to addressing the ever-growing humanitarian catastrophe unleashed by the conflict. Pius XII instructed the vast network of Catholic clergy and organizations throughout Europe to provide assistance to civilians regardless of their nationality, race, or religion. The Vatican Information Service became a hub of activity dedicated to helping displaced persons and prisoners of war, POWs. Concerned about the fates of soldiers captured in Poland, the Pope directed the creation of an office specifically to trace missing individuals and facilitate communication between POWs and their families. This sprawling network of information exchange, which involved everything from transmitting simple, alive and well messages to reuniting families sundered by the conflict, would continue throughout the war. The central and most damning allegation against Pius XII arises from his apparent silence in the face of the Holocaust. The systematic, state-orchestrated genocide of European Jewry stands as the unparalleled crime of the 20th century. Yet, throughout the war years, the Pope never issued a public encyclical explicitly condemning the extermination of the Jews or naming Nazi Germany as the perpetrator. This silence has fueled decades of controversy and soul-searching, casting a long shadow over his legacy. A city under two banners, Vatican and the Nazi occupation. As the war progressed, the evidence available to the Vatican became more damning. By 1942, reports detailing mass killings and the existence of purpose-built death camps like Auschwitz were reaching Rome. Some of the most distressing information was transmitted through diplomatic channels from sources the Vatican had reason to trust. One such example was Monsignor Giuseppe Burzio, the Vatican's chargé d'affaires in Slovakia, who conveyed first-hand descriptions of the genocide occurring there. Defenders of Pius XII argue that his public silence was a strategic necessity, driven by several concerns. There were genuine fears that open condemnation of Nazi Germany and their genocidal actions would worsen the plight of Jews and Catholics living under their rule. Hitler had already shown a complete disregard for human life and morality, and there was no guarantee that speaking out would deter him. Counter-arguments point to instances when vocal protests by religious leaders in occupied countries, such as the Netherlands, did yield some concessions and saved lives. The Vatican believed its neutrality allowed it to continue providing humanitarian aid, however limited, and to play a possible future role as a peace mediator. Breaking that neutrality, they argued, would jeopardize these efforts. However, the effectiveness of this humanitarian assistance, especially in contrast to the enormity of the crimes being committed, is harshly questioned by critics. One of the dominant fears for Pius VII was the expansion of the Soviet Union and the spread of atheist communism. The Nazis were seen as a brutal but potentially lesser evil, a bulwark against Bolshevism, spreading into the heart of Europe. Whether this chilling calculus justified the silence on genocide continues to be debated. The war transformed Rome, the eternal city steeped in Christian history, into a place of fear, resistance, and moral reckoning. The German occupation of Italy following Mussolini's fall in 1943 had profound consequences for the Vatican, testing both the policy of neutrality and the Pope's influence. When German troops entered Rome in September of 1943, it marked the beginning of a 9-month occupation of brutality and privation. The Nazis viewed the city as an enemy capital and a vital strategic location, enforcing their control through terror. Gestapo headquarters were established on Via Tasso, its cells a grim testament to torture and summary executions. The Nazi occupiers were particularly focused on crushing Italian resistance movements that sprang up after the country's armistice with the Allies. Resistance fighters conducted sabotage operations and assassinations, leading to reprisals of escalating cruelty against innocent civilians. One of the most infamous was the Ardeatine Caves massacre of 1944, where 335 civilians were executed in retaliation for a partisan attack that killed 33 German soldiers. Life for the ordinary citizens of Rome became a daily struggle for survival. Food was scarce, the black market thrived, and the constant threat of roundups and violence instilled terror. Within this crucible, another tragedy would unfold, one that placed the Vatican in an agonizing dilemma. The German occupation of Rome placed the Vatican City in a precarious position. Technically, the Lateran Treaty guaranteed its sovereignty and neutrality. Yet, the Vatican was an island within a city now ruled by a regime hostile to the Church. The Nazis could have easily violated the treaty, seized the Vatican, and arrested the Pope, a deterrent only as powerful as Hitler's tactical calculations. Pius VII made a fateful decision. He would not flee Rome. While his advisors counseled leaving for the safety of neutral Portugal or Spain, the Pope was adamant. Abandoning his flock, he argued, would be an act of cowardice and would fatally undermine the Church's moral standing. There were also concerns that a pope in exile would become a puppet of the Allied powers, further eroding neutrality. Historians continue to debate whether remaining in Rome was an act of courage or a catastrophic miscalculation. The consequences of staying were profound. The Vatican became both a sanctuary and a prison. While its physical borders remained mostly untouched, Pius XII was, in effect, a hostage to the occupying forces. His movements were restricted, his communications monitored, and the threat of outright violence towards himself or the Church was always present. One of the most damning indictments of Pius XII's wartime legacy is the limited Vatican response to the roundup and deportation of Rome's Jewish community. For centuries, Rome had been home to a thriving Jewish presence, deeply interwoven with the life of the city. Despite early Nazi persecutions, Italy under Mussolini had, until the German occupation, been a relatively safe haven compared to other parts of Europe. This abruptly changed in the fall of 1943. On September 26, 1943, the Nazi SS command in Rome demanded a ransom of 50 kilograms of gold from the Jewish community to be delivered within 36 hours or face mass deportations. The community managed to gather the gold, but it proved a futile gesture. Just 10 days later, on October 16th, the Nazis launched a raid in the historic Jewish ghetto, rounding up over 1,000 people. These men, women, and children were sent to Auschwitz, and only a handful would ever return. The Pope was swiftly informed of the atrocity. Some argue that his failure to issue an immediate, forceful public condemnation was a moral abdication. Others insist that such action would have been suicidal, jeopardizing the limited aid the Vatican could provide and potentially triggering even wider reprisals against Jews and Catholics alike. It is undeniable that some efforts were made behind the scenes. Vatican officials and ordinary priests and nuns inspired by the Pope's call for charity hid many Jews within monasteries, convents, and other church properties. Estimates vary, but several thousand Jews are believed to have survived the war thanks to these courageous acts. From swastika to Red Star, Pius XII and the Cold War. The unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany on May 8, 1945, brought a long-awaited end to World War II in Europe. However, the joy of liberation was quickly overshadowed by new anxieties as ideological fault lines hardened and a new global struggle emerged. For Pius XII, the defeat of Nazism did not usher in an era of peace, but rather marked the beginning of a crusade against another totalitarian menace, communism. Pius XII saw the vulnerability of traumatized and impoverished societies as fertile ground for atheist, Marxist ideologies promising radical change. His fears were not unfounded, as communist parties in both Western and Eastern Europe gained strength, aided by Soviet influence. Italy, with its large, disenfranchised working class, was particularly susceptible. The Pope urged Catholic political movements, especially the newly formed Christian Democrats, to resist communist advances and promote social reconstruction based on Catholic teachings. The specter of communism had haunted the Vatican for decades. The Soviet Union's state-mandated atheism, suppression of religious institutions, and history of persecuting Christians made it anathema to the Church. Pius XII became one of the most vocal anti-communist figures on the world stage. He saw this as a holy war, a clash of civilizations between the godless Soviet bloc and those nations that retained Christian values, regardless of whether they were Catholic or Protestant. This staunch anti-communism had several consequences. It shaped the Vatican's policy in the post-war recovery, influencing which leaders and factions received support. Critics argue that this single-minded focus blinded the Pope to some morally ambiguous figures. Former fascists and collaborators, if they were seen as bulwarks against communism, were welcomed back into the fold, raising questions about how justice would be served for past crimes. Despite the Vatican's preoccupation with the Red Menace, Pius XII continued to champion humanitarian causes, although these were increasingly influenced by Cold War calculations. The Church, with its global network, played a significant role in aiding refugees and displaced persons. One of the most dramatic operations involved assisting German prisoners of war still held in the Soviet Union well after the war's official end. Pius XII intervened directly with Stalin, securing the release of some prisoners. Pope Pius continued his struggle against communism and served as the head of the Catholic Church until his death in October 1958.